This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. Hello, I'm Oliver Conway, and this edition is published in the early hours of Monday, the 18th of May. Our main stories. Benjamin Netanyahu proves his skills as a political survivor, securing another term as Israeli Prime Minister and vowing to take control of parts of the occupied West Bank. Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani and his rival Abdullah Abdullah sign a power-sharing deal, ending months of political uncertainty. Also in the podcast, the latest on the coronavirus as Brazil struggles to cope with a surge in infections.
My hospital is dealing with a new series of cases that we have never seen before. From someday it starts to overflow with patients.
And news from a Russian republic raises more concern that the authorities are playing down the true impact of COVID-19. A unity government has finally been sworn in Israel after 3 inconclusive elections in a year.
אם כך, חברות וחברי הכנסת, בעד 73, נגד...
In a deal approved by a vote in the Israeli parliament or Knesset, Benjamin Netanyahu will keep his job as Israeli Prime Minister, despite facing 3 trials on corruption charges. He'll serve as Prime Minister for 18 months, then hand over to his rival Benny Gantz, who had long insisted he would never join a Netanyahu government. It's another example of Mr. Netanyahu's ability to hold on to power, and it could spell trouble ahead for the Palestinians, because he's promised to annex parts of the occupied West Bank.
The hundreds of thousands of settlers in Judea and Samaria, our brothers and sisters, will always remain in their places as part of any permanent agreement for peace, and it is time that our Palestinian neighbours recognise this.
However, the move is illegal under international law and has been rejected by the Palestinians. With more on the new Israeli administration, our Middle East correspondent Yolande Knell spoke to my colleague James Menendez.
Well, this unity government is one which is a record large size for Israel. There are 36 ministers and 16 deputy ministers. It's being billed as a unity government that will deal with the emergency situation caused by the coronavirus crisis. We were told really many times on the campaign trail by Benny Gantz, the main political rival of Netanyahu, the former army chief, that he would not serve with somebody who was facing serious criminal charges, as Mr. Netanyahu does. He's due to start his trial in 1 week's time, although he denies any wrongdoing. But then there was this... amid the coronavirus crisis, a surprising U-turn by Mr. Gantz, and he left his former allies. This partnership was set up. So it allows Mr. Netanyahu to continue his tenure as Israel's longest-serving Prime Minister, at least for now, and ends what's been more than a year of political uncertainty in Israel, something unprecedented in its history. Israelis have been to the polls 3 times with inconclusive results.
How's it going to work with the corruption trial, though? As you say, it begins in a week. How's he going to be able to govern?
Well, that has been a big question. There was a High Court challenge, but under Israeli law, the Prime Minister, until he's found guilty, does not have to step down from serving. But the power-sharing agreement with Mr. Gantz, I should say, means that Mr. Netanyahu will continue in his role for the next 18 months, and then Mr. Gantz will take over for a further 18 months. He starts off as Defence Minister, and then he should become Prime Minister himself.
And tell us a bit more about this pledge to annex parts of the West Bank. What does that entail exactly?
Well, this is a promise that Mr. Netanyahu made to his right-wing nationalist base on the campaign trail, and actually the agreement to set up this government sets the 1st of July as the starting date for cabinet discussions. It's something that's actually written into the agreement. This is, of course, something that's very strongly rejected by the Palestinians, by many in the international community. Settlements are considered illegal under international law, although Israel disputes this, now has US backing for its position. It also wants to annex the Jordan Valley. Israel says that's a necessary area for its security. These are all parts of the West Bank that the Palestinians want for their hoped-for future state.
Are there voices in Israel warning against this?
There are, even from high up in the security establishment, there are those who argue that this threatens Israel's peace deals with Egypt and with Jordan. There's lots of worries about the negative effect of the prospects on any eventual two-state solution to the conflict with the Palestinians, and this could endanger ceasefire understandings in Gaza. It could topple the Palestinian Authority. That's another fear as well. That could lead to instability and violence in the West Bank. And what a lot of security officials, in particular in Israel, are pointing out is why take this risk, because already Israel does have full security and administrative control of these parts of the West Bank that we're talking about.
Yolande Knell in Jerusalem. Now to more power sharing between two bitter rivals, this time in Afghanistan. And history has repeated itself, with Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah Abdullah agreeing to work together once again following a disputed presidential election. But this time, unlike in 2014, President Ghani said they were able to reach a deal without mediation from the Americans.
Today is a historic day for our dear Afghanistan. Afghans have proven that they are committed to the national interests with common thinking and plans. We have shown that without the mediation of international friends, we can reach a fundamental solution in a reasonable way.
The two had been at loggerheads for months, even as the coronavirus began to spread and jihadists stepped up attacks in Afghanistan. Our South Asia editor Anbarasan Etirajan told me more about the agreement.
The first thing is Mr. Ghani will remain as president, but he cannot choose his entire cabinet because 50% of the cabinet members will be appointed by his rival, Dr. Abdullah Abdullah. And also, Dr. Abdullah will have a say in the appointment of governors in the 34 provinces of Afghanistan. So in a way, Mr. Ghani has agreed to share power with Mr. Abdullah after these months of wrangling between these two sides. All these things happening at a time of increased Taliban attacks and the coronavirus outbreak in the country, and the healthcare system is literally non-existent in many parts of the country. That has really, really devastated, many Afghans, feeling that when the country is really burning and these two are fighting for their own political share. And also, in February, the US signed a deal with the Taliban for a troop withdrawal. And now the Afghans are supposed to start a dialogue with the Taliban. And now finally they've come together, sharing this political structure, and they hope to start dialogue with the Taliban. And Mr. Abdullah has been appointed as the chief of the High Commission for Peace.
Yeah, what is the significance of having Abdullah as the negotiating role for the Afghan government?
Well, what the experts are saying is there are two groups. One, adopting a very hardline approach towards Taliban because they think Kabul government is the elected government, elected by the people, and they should have more say. But the agreement was signed between US and the Taliban prior to this. So what the Taliban are saying is that, we are controlling or influential in nearly a third of the country and we are bargaining from a position of strength. But the Kabul government doesn't want to give up its eminent position. Now, Mr. Abdullah is widely seen as, pro-US, and he will be conducting or he will be overseeing these negotiations with the Taliban. So how much influence Mr. Ghani and his team, the hardline approach, will have in these peace talks, in the coming peace talks with the Taliban, whether they will be sidelined or whether Taliban's demands will be granted, that remains to be seen. And that is the key thing about the appointment of Dr. Abdullah.
Anbarasan Etirajan. Reports from the Democratic Republic of Congo say at least 20 civilians have been killed during an overnight attack in the northeast. A local official in Ituri province said another 17 people had been injured. Our Africa editor Will Ross reports.
Local officials say men from a notorious militia known as Codeco attacked at night using machetes. Women and children are amongst the victims. Codeco recruits mainly from the Lendu community, an ethnic group that's for years fought with the rival Hema people who also live in this fertile area of Ituri province. In recent months, the Congolese militaries launched an offensive against different rebel groups in the northeast. But this has led to a surge of rebel attacks against civilians. There's now a lot of anger at the military's failure to protect the villages in Ituri, where the UN says 200,000 people have had to flee their homes in just 2 months.
Will Ross. Next to Albania. And that's the sound of a mechanical excavator demolishing the National Theatre building in the Albanian capital Tirana in the early hours of Sunday. Police clashed with protesters, some of who had been holding a sit-in. The EU delegation to Albania condemned the destruction of the theatre, which was built during the Italian occupation in 1939. So why was the building demolished? Our Balkans correspondent is Guy Delaunay.
This is a personal project, really, of Prime Minister Edi Rama, who's been resolute in his promotion of the construction of a new national theatre. Lots of people didn't agree with that in Albania. They've been fighting against this for more than 2 years. And we're talking about a coalition here of people involved in the arts, cultural heritage organisations who saw value in the building itself, and the political opposition who saw something that could rally around and try and work against Prime Minister Rama's government. And the immediate justification for the demolition, though, is that the City Council a few days ago passed a motion to go ahead with it, though going ahead in the early hours of Sunday morning really wasn't on anybody's agenda.
Yeah, and what are they going to build in its place?
Well, this is the thing. We've had people online at the moment. So the mayor of Tirana, Erion Veliaj, saying that, look, you might feel very, very upset about this, and I understand that you might feel a loss over this, but what's coming next is going to be much better. He says they've got a beautiful new national theatre that's been designed by Danish architects, and this is going to be part of the project to really remake Tirana into a newer, better, more modern city that's better for its people to live in. He actually described the old National Theatre, the one which is now gone, of course, as the only dark spot in the city, something which had been made of cheap material, put up quickly in fascist times, and which had been condemned by experts as a health and safety hazard.
And yet the EU criticised the destruction. Could this affect Albania's efforts to join the EU?
Well, I doubt it'll affect the opening of accession negotiations because that green light has already been given. But the optics, as they like to say these days, certainly aren't good. If you're knocking down a public building, really doing it in the early hours of Sunday morning, having dragged away protesters, including people from the artistic community, that doesn't look good. And it's really a gift to the opposition, who are able to say, well, look, this Rama government isn't as democratic as it's making itself out to be.
Our Balkans correspondent Guy Delaunay. Still to come on the Global News podcast, the latest on the coronavirus, including a drop in fatalities in Europe and how South Africa's pandemic prohibition is turning people into criminals.
It's giving me a business, but it's giving us bad name because we deal with big gangsters to get cigarettes.
These people are quite scary, are they?
Yes, they are very scary. They carry guns around. They can't trust anyone.
Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro may have dismissed the coronavirus as a little flu, but his country has been badly affected. More than 15,000 people have died, and there could be worse to come. Brazil now has the fourth highest number of infections in the world, 235,000. The health system in its largest city, Sao Paulo, is on the brink of collapse, according to the mayor, and Rio de Janeiro is also suffering. Our America's editor, Candice Piet, told me more.
Well, Bruno Covas, the city mayor, is saying that they've got 2 weeks before they're going to be totally overwhelmed. They say already 6 of the city's public hospitals have no beds available. And he says they've reached 90% capacity elsewhere, and that he's very much saying that there's very difficult times coming. Now, Sao Paulo is one of the main hotspots of Brazil's growing pandemic. It's had around 3,000 deaths and around 40,000 confirmed cases. But the virus has also been hitting the very well-connected south of Brazil, southeast of Brazil, and neighbouring Rio has also been finding it very hard to cope. To get an idea of what Brazilian doctors are dealing with, we heard from a doctor, Marcelo Kallichstein, who's an intensive care unit doctor in Rio.
My hospital is dealing with a new series of cases that we have never seen before. And from some day it starts to overflow with patients. And now in our hospital, we have more than half of our capacity of treating patients with coronavirus confirmed patients, and more than half of them on the ICU. It's a very, very difficult disease because we are learning through the disease.
Dr. Marcelo Kallichstein in Rio. And what does this mean for the arguments about restrictions or lifting the lockdown? Because the president obviously in favour of opening up the economy, but mayors in places like Sao Paulo want restrictions to be tighter.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think Sao Paulo is the economic engine of Brazil, and it's a very difficult and hard decision for any mayor of São Paulo to make, to close the city down in any way. I mean, partly because Brazilians haven't been given very many financial help during the coronavirus, and so now the mayor Bruno Covas is saying that he really needs political consensus now. He wants to achieve a total lockdown instead of the kind of much lighter kind of social distancing regulations that are in place. He wants to bring forward some upcoming holidays to get people to stay at home. Now, this all goes very much against what President Bolsonaro says. And now today, President Bolsonaro again appeared in front of the presidential palace in Brasilia to meet supporters, wearing a mask but mingling and touching people. He's a great skeptic about coronavirus, and he's used all these occasions every Sunday to repeat his message that he thinks social distancing will only wreck the economy. And of course, he has a lot of support in São Paulo.
Candice Peard. 2 months ago, the WHO declared that Europe had become the epicentre of the pandemic. But now much of the continent appears to have gained a measure of control over the outbreak. European governments are reporting falling fatality and infection rates and, as a result, are beginning to ease restrictions. One example is Spain, where on Sunday the health ministry said the number of deaths recorded in the previous 24 hours had fallen below 100 for the first time since the lockdown. As I heard from our correspondent in Spain, Guy Hedgeko.
The daily death count at 87 is way down below what we were seeing, for example, at the beginning of April, when we were seeing nearly 1,000 people dying each day of coronavirus here in Spain. Now, the new infections today, for example, we've seen 400 or so more new infections. That number has been dropping very steadily as well since it was peaking in early mid-April. We've got 30,000 or so infections overall, but both the numbers of new infections and daily deaths have been coming down very steadily, and the government attributes both those things in great part to the fact that the country has been under this very strict lockdown since mid-March.
But it has slowly been lifting that, more controls to be eased on Monday, but not so much in Barcelona or Madrid where you are.
No, that's right. And it's quite a complex process. The government wants this to be a 3-phase process. So, as you say, several parts of the country, or around half the country, is already in what is known as phase 1. It's been in that for the last few days. So that means that sort of cafes and bars and restaurants have been able to serve customers to a certain extent, for example. There have been some other lifting of restrictions in those areas. But, as you say, Madrid and Barcelona have not been in that situation. We've seen tougher restrictions remaining in place. And what, for example, the authorities here in Madrid hope is that in a few days' time, Madrid can move into that phase 1. But it is quite a complex system, and it varies from province to province. And as the government points out, it's going to be very gradual. And what it hopes is that by the end of June, pretty much all of Spain will be back to something like normal.
Guy Hedgeko in Madrid. The most controversial of South Africa's lockdown measures has been the ban on cigarettes and alcohol. Health experts say it's helped reduce crime and injuries and allowed the police and medics to focus on tackling the virus. But critics say the prohibition plays into the hands of criminal gangs and damages the fragile economy. Our correspondent Andrew Harding reports on the South Africans risking jail by defying the ban.
It's early evening and we're following a police van patrolling the dark streets of Johannesburg. And it's not just the lockdown they're trying to enforce here. An officer jumps out to chase a woman. She's got something in her hand. Could she be selling cigarettes? She's bundled into the van. The sale of cigarettes and alcohol is now strictly prohibited here. Lieutenant General Elias Malewa is the provincial police commissioner.
We have arrested a lot of people for being in possession of illegal cigarettes and so forth, and some they were still dealing with liquor. The law doesn't make anybody a criminal. It's about a personal choice.
But the next morning, we find a group of youngsters, many still of school age, selling contraband cigarettes on a street corner.
I can sell 10 boxes.
Just under £15 in a day, you know. They say it's not a personal choice. It's about making money to support their families during the lockdown. Do you like the ban on cigarettes? It gives you a business, yeah?
It's giving me a business, but it's giving us bad name because we deal with big gangsters to get cigarettes.
So how do you meet these gangsters? Do they come to you or do you go to them?
No, they don't want to meet us because even us, they don't trust us.
These people are quite scary, are they?
Yes, they are very scary. They carry guns around. They can't trust anyone.
Do you feel ashamed of doing this criminal activity, or do you think this is a stupid law?
I feel ashamed because at home it's not okay.
Rather have a proper job, a legal job.
Exactly.
Okay, now I must use my hands. I use 1 cup of brown sugar. I use 2 packets of yeast and 1 pineapple. Mix it in the 1 packet.
A few blocks away, a 43-year-old receptionist is preparing another batch of homebrewed beer. She lost her job to the lockdown and, a bit like the cigarette sellers, she says this is now her only way to feed her 3 young children. How many customers do you have at the moment?
More than 40 a day.
What would happen to you if you were caught making this and selling this?
The police, if they can catch me, they put me in a jail.
Are you afraid of that?
Yes, I'm afraid. Because my kids, who can look after my kids?
Not surprisingly, the legal alcohol and cigarette industries are lobbying hard, anxious to persuade the government to water down the restrictions that are damaging their businesses and the national economy.
Hi, Andrew. My name is Zoleka Lisa, and I'm the Vice President for Corporate Affairs at the South African Breweries. We're a huge manufacturer, we're a huge employer, so it's really important that we are given a fair chance to come back online sooner rather than later.
In the meantime, this. The sound of beer being flushed down the drain, 20 million bottles worth, to clear a nation's clogged breweries. Another unintended consequence of South Africa's divisive coronavirus prohibition.
That report from Andrew Harding in South Africa. 40 doctors have now died of COVID-19 in the Russian Republic of Dagestan, according to the health minister. That's higher than the total number of fatalities for the territory as reported by the authorities. The discrepancy adds to concern that Russia has been playing down the true impact of the coronavirus, a claim officials have denied. From Moscow, Sarah Rainsford reports.
There is no official count of all the Russian healthcare workers who've died of coronavirus, but the health minister of Dagestan has now revealed that 40 have lost their lives in that one republic alone, which he called a tragedy. The COVID-19 statistics posted each day in Dagestan show just 27 deaths from the virus so far, but the minister now says 657 have died of pneumonia in the same period. They're all patients who had the symptoms of COVID-19, but no positive test results. Earlier this month, a group of doctors wrote to President Putin warning that such underreporting was angering people locally. They complained that officials were more concerned about looking good to Moscow than working to protect Dagestani lives. Civil society groups there have also warned that many people are dying in their villages, never making it to hospital and so going undiagnosed. The minister's interview was with an independent blogger. That's unusual in itself for Russia, where so much of the media is state-controlled. He offered few explanations, though, for the scale of the crisis in Dagestan. He insisted there are now spare beds in local hospitals and some signs that the situation could be stabilising. He also denied reports that doctors were under pressure to keep quiet about their concerns.
Sarah Rainsford. Fiji, like much of the Pacific region, has so far escaped the worst of the pandemic, having closed its borders early to international travellers. But that has damaged Fiji's tourist industry, which accounts for about a third of economic output. Thousands of people have been made redundant. In order to get by, many are turning to bartering for the things they need via a Facebook page that now has 140,000 members. Marlene Duta set it up, and from Fiji's capital Suva, she's been talking to the BBC's James Menendez.
We've had massive job losses across the country. It's a tight situation for cash. So we offered this group, this Facebook platform, to allow people to still maintain some sort of livelihood or some sort of living, a standard of living, by being able to trade things that they do already have for things that they needed.
And how does it work exactly then?
You join the group and you post up where you are, your location, what you have to offer, and what you want in return. And you have people coming on to either accept your offer, and then you go off, exchange details, and do the trade.
Can you give us some examples?
Lots of requests coming in, exchanging for pot plants with books, baked goods. Baked goods have been very popular on the page for other groceries or seedlings and plants, vegetable cuttings to plant. So that there's been a lot of that. We've had another fantastic story of a young woman whose father had lost a job in the middle of building their house. And she baked donuts and gave away donuts every day for 6 days and collected over 650 concrete blocks, cement, powder, and just a whole bunch of building materials, which allowed them to then carry on building their house.
Marlene, what's the most unusual one you've seen?
Well, in the early days, one of the first few ones that struck a lot of curiosity was we had a male and a female piglet in exchange for a kayak. They're not really unusual, I guess, if you know the Fiji context, but they are certainly varied.
So anything goes, really. Is there a history of
Yes.
bartering in Fiji?
Well, in the early days, sure. Before money was a medium, we had our own exchanges with what they call the imbe, the mat, some shell money, the tambur, which is the whale's tooth, a few other mediums. But bartering, it's a natural part of how we live.
And just thinking about the economic situation, how worried are people, given that tourism, I guess, has just collapsed because people aren't flying in?
I happen to live in Suva, which is not really the tourist belt. This is more the manufacturing and business sector and government sector here. And so we're not feeling it, well, we are feeling it, but not as bad. The Western Division, which is primarily the tourism zone, they really are feeling it. Massive job losses. People are living on either their savings or scraping together whatever they can.
And are people feeling, though, that, for the moment it's worth, sealing the border, stopping people coming in and bringing in COVID-19? Or are they starting to think that actually that lockdown needs to ease if the economy's going to get moving again?
We're probably close to that. We haven't had a positive case here in 27 days. We're in good stead to open up. The thing is, we need everybody else to open up as well, and that doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon.
Marlene Dutta talking to James Menendez from Suva in Fiji. And that is all from us for now. There'll be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on the podcast or anything in it, email globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Oliver Conway. Until next time, goodbye.